When we look back at history, there is a quiet comfort in believing we are better now. We tell ourselves that the past was cruel because people were ignorant, that atrocities happened because societies lacked information, lacked connection, lacked empathy. And from a distance, that explanation feels safe. It allows us to believe that progress itself is a moral force, that technology, education, and global awareness naturally pull humanity away from evil. But that belief collapses when you study events where knowledge did not prevent cruelty, where intelligence did not restrain violence, and where progress became the very tool that made suffering more efficient. Some of the worst crimes in human history were not committed by uneducated mobs or chaotic regimes. They were carried out by trained professionals, doctors, scientists, administrators, people who understood exactly what they were doing. Unit 731 is one of those moments in history that makes the idea of moral evolution deeply uncomfortable. Because this was not a story of desperation, it was not a story of chaos. It was a story of organization, planning, and long-term intent. It was a system built carefully, defended intellectually, and maintained with full awareness of its consequences. What makes Unit 731 difficult to confront is not just the scale of suffering involved, but the mindset behind it. The people responsible did not believe they were monsters. They believed they were necessary. They believed they were justified. Some even believed they were advancing humanity. And that is the most dangerous idea of all. When violence is framed as purpose, when suffering is reframed as data, when human beings become variables instead of lives, the boundary between civilization and barbarism disappears quietly, without resistance. This is not a story about a single experiment gone wrong. It is not even a story about war alone. It is a story about how easily intelligence detaches from morality when authority gives permission. And if there is any reason this story still matters, it is because the conditions that allowed it to happen are not relics of the past. They are patterns. Patterns that repeat whenever power, ideology, and dehumanization align. Before we go any further, it's important to understand this clearly. What happened was not inevitable. It was chosen, repeatedly, by people who woke up every day, went to work, and returned home believing they were serving something greater than themselves. That belief is where this story begins. Before we go any further, there is something that needs to be said clearly and without dramatization. The story you are about to hear involves extreme violence. Not implied violence, not symbolic violence, but real, deliberate harm inflicted on human beings, women, men, children, prisoners of war, civilians, by an organized system that operated with full institutional support. I will be careful with my language. I will avoid unnecessary detail where possible, but no amount of careful wording can fully soften what this history contains. This is not a story meant to shock for entertainment. There is no spectacle here. There are no twists designed to impress. What you are about to hear is heavy, and it remains heavy no matter how it is told. If you are sensitive to discussions of torture, medical abuse, or systemic cruelty, there is no obligation to continue. Walking away from this story is not a failure of understanding. Protecting your mental health matters more than finishing any video. For those who do choose to stay, it's important to understand the tone of what follows. There will be no jokes to relieve the tension, no ironic distance, no attempt to make this easier than it is. This is one of those subjects where discomfort is not a flaw of the presentation, it is a reflection of the reality. Even researching this material carries a cost. Reading primary accounts, testimonies, and post-war records is exhausting in a way that lingers. Not because the information is complex, but because the intent behind it is so clear. What happened was not hidden behind confusion or misunderstanding. It was planned, it was funded, it was justified repeatedly by people who knew exactly what they were authorizing. And that clarity is what makes this story difficult to sit with. We often assume that atrocities happen when control collapses, when society breaks down, when chaos takes over. Unit 731 challenges that assumption. It existed not in chaos, but in structure. Not in desperation, but in long-term strategy. If there is a single reason this story is worth telling, it is not because it is unique. It is because it demonstrates how easily human suffering can be reframed as necessity when authority demands it. So again, this is your moment to step away if you need to. For those continuing, understand this. What follows is not meant to be consumed casually. It is meant to be remembered. Not because remembering fixes anything, but because forgetting makes repetition easier. With that said, before we enter the darkest parts of this history, there is one brief pause, a moment to reset, because once we move forward, there is no clean place to stop. Before we move forward, there's a brief pause that needs to happen, not to make this easier, not to soften what's coming, but because stories like this, when told without interruption, can overwhelm to the point where the details blur together. And when that happens, the reality loses its shape. So consider this a moment to breathe, to reset your attention. What follows is not a gradual descent, it is a deliberate one. And once it begins, it does not offer many natural breaks. There's a tendency, when discussing historical atrocities, to frame them as distant, as abstract, as something safely contained in textbooks and timelines. But what we're about to discuss did not feel abstract to the people who experienced it. It was immediate. It was daily. It was methodical. This is also the last point where the story exists mostly in ideas. From here on, it becomes concrete. We are going to move from philosophy to policy, from mindset to machinery, from justification to implementation. And to understand how something like Unit 731 could exist, we need to start where most systems of organized violence begin, not with monsters, but with governments, strategy, and fear of falling behind. That context matters. Not to excuse what happened, but to explain how it was allowed to grow. With that in mind, we move into the world that made Unit 731 possible. To understand how Unit 731 came into existence, we have to step back to a moment when global warfare was changing faster than ethics could keep up. In the aftermath of World War I, the world witnessed the devastating effectiveness of chemical weapons. Gas attacks in the trenches had introduced a new kind of horror, one that didn't rely on bullets or bombs, but on invisible forces that turned air itself into a weapon. In response, the international community drafted the Geneva Protocol of 1925, banning the use of chemical and biological weapons. On paper, this was a moral line drawn in the sand. In reality, it was also a challenge. Not every nation accepted the treaty in good faith. Some viewed it not as a safeguard, but as a limitation imposed by rivals. Imperial Japan was one of them. While publicly acknowledging the agreement, Japanese military leadership quietly began asking a different question. If biological warfare was banned, how powerful must it be? By the early 1932, Japan was already expanding aggressively into mainland Asia. China, fragmented and technologically behind, became both a battlefield and an opportunity. Japanese forces encountered large civilian populations with minimal international oversight, far from Western scrutiny, and largely voiceless on the global stage. At the same time, military strategists were becoming increasingly concerned about falling behind other global power. There was a growing belief that future wars would not be won by conventional weapons alone, but by scientific superiority. Disease, infection, and environmental manipulation were no longer theoretical concepts. They were potential tools. This is where medicine intersected with militarism. A Japanese army surgeon named Shiro Ishii emerged as a key advocate for biological research. Ishii was not a fringe figure. He was educated, well-connected, and persuasive. He argued that biological weapons represented the next frontier of warfare, and that Japan needed to act quickly before rival nations, particularly the United States, did the same. The logic was simple, and that simplicity made it dangerous. Biological weapons could incapacitate entire populations. They could destabilize supply lines, overwhelm medical systems, and spread beyond the battlefield itself. But unlike conventional weapons, they required testing, and testing required human subjects. This is where ideology filled the moral gap. Imperial Japan operated under a rigid hierarchy of value. At the top was the state, beneath it, the military. Beneath that, the individual whose worth was measured by usefulness and loyalty. Those outside the empire, particularly occupied populations, were viewed not as equals, but as expendable. This worldview did not need to be invented for Unit 731. It already existed. Unit 731 simply gave it a laboratory. In 1932, the Japanese government appointed Ishii as head of the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory. Publicly, this organization existed to protect Japanese troops from disease. Its name was carefully chosen. It suggested defense, sanitation, and public health. Privately, its purpose was the opposite. The laboratory's true function was to explore how disease could be weaponized, controlled, and deployed. And from the beginning, the distinction between research and atrocity was intentionally blurred. Early experiments were conducted in occupied regions of China, far from international observers. These locations provided not only isolation, but a steady supply of people who had already been stripped of legal and political protection. This is an important point to emphasize. Unit 731 did not begin as a rogue operation. It did not exist in defiance of the state. It was authorized, funded, and protected by the highest levels of military command. Every expansion of its mission was approved. Every escalation was justified internally as necessary for national survival. By the mid-1932s, what began as a research initiative had evolved into a formal unit within the Japanese military structure. It had personnel, resources, and long-term objectives. And most importantly, it had permission. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether atrocities would occur. The only remaining question was how far they would go. At the beginning, the violence did not arrive all at once. It rarely does. What made the early phase of Unit 731 so effective and so dangerous was how gradual it felt from the inside. Each step was framed as reasonable, each decision was defended as temporary, each escalation was justified as necessary for the next breakthrough. The first facilities operated under the guise of medical research stations in occupied regions of China. Officially, these sites existed to study disease prevention among troops. Unofficially, they were designed to answer a far more disturbing question. How much could the human body endure, and how could that knowledge be weaponized? Civilians were taken quietly, sometimes labeled as criminals, sometimes as political threats, often with no label at all. Once inside the facilities, they ceased to exist as individuals. Names were removed, identities erased. What remained were bodies. This early stage focused less on spectacle and more on control. Prisoners were deliberately kept healthy. They were fed adequately. They were monitored. Their physical condition was preserved not out of mercy, but out of necessity. A weakened subject produced unreliable data. A healthy one could be pushed further. From there, the experiments began in ways that, on paper, resembled clinical observation. Controlled starvation, dehydration, blood loss measured over time, exposure to disease under monitored condition. The language used to describe these procedures was sterile, technical, and intentionally distant from their reality. This language mattered. By replacing words like person with terms like material or subject, the researchers created a psychological buffer. Pain became a variable, death became an endpoint. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. One of the earliest and most telling practices was live dissection. Subjects infected with diseases such as plague or cholera were cut open while still conscious, allowing researchers to observe the progression of illness in real time. Anesthesia was often avoided not because it was unavailable, but because it interfered with data accuracy. From the researcher's perspective, this was efficiency. From any other perspective, it was torture. Yet even here, the system protected itself. These acts were not described as executions. They were described as examinations. Reports were written, data was cataloged, findings were prepared for publication, often disguised as animal studies or anonymized field research. This stage of Unit 731 existed in a kind of moral limbo. Those involved could still tell themselves a story in which what they were doing had purpose. They were not killers, they believed. They were pioneers. They were preventing future suffering by enduring necessary cruelty now. That illusion did not last. As the experiments continued, it became clear that the knowledge gained was not merely theoretical. it had applications. And once application became the goal, the scale had to increase. The facilities expanded. More subjects were required. More variables needed testing. What began as isolated experimentation slowly transformed into a routine operation. And with routine came normalization. Researchers who initially hesitated learned quickly that hesitation had no place here. Promotions favored compliance. Silence was rewarded. Questioning the work marked you as weak, unreliable, or disloyal. By the time the early phase ended, something fundamental had changed. The experiments were no longer testing limits. They were redefining them. And the people inside these facilities, both those conducting the work and those subjected to it, were no longer participants in a research program. They were components in a system that had learned how to operate without conscience. Once the early experiments proved successful, the logic of expansion became unavoidable. Small-scale testing was no longer enough. Data gathered from a handful of subjects could suggest possibilities, but it could not guarantee reliability. If biological warfare was to become a strategic asset, it needed consistency, and consistency required scale. This is where Unit 731 stopped resembling a research project and began operating like an institution. Funding increased. Personnel multiplied. Entire complexes were constructed specifically for experimentation. The most infamous of these facilities was built near Pingfang, in occupied Manchuria. It was not hidden in a basement or improvised in secret. It was massive, permanent, and carefully designed. From the outside, the complex appeared legitimate. There were administrative buildings, medical offices, guard posts, even areas designed to mislead visitors into believing the site was involved in water purification and public health. The real work, however, happened underground. Prisoners were transported through concealed routes, moved through tunnels that ensured they would never see the surrounding area. Disorientation was intentional. If no one knew where they were, escape became irrelevant. Inside, the system functioned with chilling efficiency. Human beings were cataloged, assigned numbers, sorted by age, sex, physical condition, and perceived usefulness. The term prisoner disappeared entirely. Instead, they were referred to as logs, a coded language that allowed staff to speak about people without acknowledging their humanity. How many logs arrived today? How many logs were used? How many logs remain? Language like this did more than obscure reality from outsiders. It reshaped how the participants thought. When a person becomes a resource, disposal feels administrative rather than moral. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 had thousands of personnel. Not all of them were directly involved in experimentation. Some were guards, some were technicians, some were administrators. But every role contributed to the same outcome. This is an important distinction. Atrocities on this scale do not require everyone to be cruel. They require enough people to perform narrow tasks without asking what those tasks serve. As Japan's war in China intensified, the scope of experimentation expanded alongside it. Diseases were no longer studied only in controlled environments. Field tests began. Entire villages were exposed to pathogens through contaminated food, water, and insect vectors. Researchers would release plague-infected fleas into populated areas and observe the results from a distance. Afterward, they would enter in protective gear, documenting symptoms, death rates, and spread patterns. From their perspective, this was real-world validation. From the victim's perspective, it was annihilation without warning. Within the facilities, experimentation diversified. Conventional weapons were tested on living bodies to measure lethality at various distances. Chemical agents were deployed against restrained subjects to assess protective equipment effectiveness. Hypothermia experiments exposed how long the human body could survive freezing conditions, and what methods, if any, could reverse the damage. What's critical to understand here is that none of this happened in secrecy within the unit. Reports were written, findings were shared internally, promotions were awarded, careers were built on the efficiency of suffering. As the system matured, the moral justifications became thinner. Early claims about national defense and scientific necessity remained, but increasingly they felt like formalities. The machine no longer needed belief to operate. It needed only momentum. New staff were trained into the system. They learned quickly what questions were acceptable and which ones were not. Hesitation was interpreted as incompetence. Obedience became the measure of professionalism. By this stage, Unit 731 no longer depended on ideology alone. It had become self-sustaining. The machinery of experimentation could continue even if individual participants felt doubt, because doubt had no structural power. The system did not reward conscience. It rewarded output. And as long as data kept flowing, the suffering could continue indefinitely. This is the moment where the scale of the crime becomes impossible to attribute to a single man, a single decision, or even a single philosophy. What existed now was an apparatus, one capable of inflicting limitless harm without requiring anyone inside it to feel personally responsible. And once a system reaches that point, the question is no longer how far it can go. It is whether anything can stop it. There is a point in systems like Unit 731 where justification stops evolving. In the beginning, everything was framed around necessity, national defense, scientific urgency, the fear of being overtaken by rival powers. Those explanations, however flawed, provided a narrative that allowed participants to see themselves as contributors to something larger. But as the system expanded, something shifted. The experiments no longer existed solely to answer military questions. Many of them no longer produced useful data. Some repeated known outcomes. Others explored extremes that had no clear application at all. This is where the logic breaks. Because once suffering continues without necessity, it stops being instrumental. It becomes indulgent. Inside Unit 731, procedures emerged that could not be credibly defended as research. Human bodies were subjected to stress tests that revealed nothing new about warfare or disease. Organs were removed, not to study illness, but to observe failure. Limbs were damaged, frozen, or altered in ways that served no tactical purpose. At this stage, experimentation became a ritual rather than an inquiry. What's important to understand is that this was not hidden from leadership. Reports still moved up the chain. Oversight still existed. No one stepped in to say that the cost outweighed the benefit, because by now, the system no longer measured benefit in human terms. Efficiency replaced ethics. Subjects were no longer selected because they represented useful variables. They were selected because they were available, because they could be used, because the system expected consumption. The average lifespan of a prisoner inside the primary facility dropped dramatically. Survival was no longer an outcome worth tracking. Death became the default endpoint, not a consequence. In some cases, individuals were killed quickly during weapons testing. In others, they were kept alive just long enough to serve a sequence of procedures. The distinction mattered only for scheduling. This is the stage where the language inside the system becomes revealing. When researchers discussed outcomes, they did not speak of people dying. They spoke of failures, of breakdowns, of thresholds reached. The vocabulary was entirely mechanical. A body was no different from a device pushed past its limits. At this depth, cruelty no longer needed ideology to sustain it. It needed habit. Once enough people participate in violence long enough, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Acts that would once have caused revulsion become routine. The shock wears off, the moral response dulls. What remains is momentum. This is why the darkest phase of Unit 731 is not defined by any single act, but by repetition. The fact that such procedures continued day after day, year after year, without interruption, without meaningful dissent. No emergency forced this continuation. No battlefield collapse demanded it. The system ran because it could. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this. By the time Unit 731 reached this stage, it no longer depended on belief in superiority or hatred of the enemy. It functioned on something much simpler: indifference. When suffering becomes background noise, when death becomes paperwork, when human presence no longer registers as moral information, a system does not need monsters to sustain it. It only needs people willing to keep doing their jobs. This is the point where the story stops being about war, or science, or even ideology. It becomes a story about what happens when accountability disappears completely. And once accountability is gone, there is no internal limit to how far a system can fall. Up to this point, it is possible, however uncomfortable, to explain everything through systems. Hierarchy, obedience, dehumanization, bureaucracy. All of it provides distance. All of it allows the mind to stay detached. But there are moments in this history where that distance collapses. Moments that make it impossible to argue that the people involved simply didn't know what they were doing. One such moment comes not from an experiment, but from an interaction. There is at least one recorded instance of a staff member forming a brief, quiet connection with prisoners. Two young women, one Chinese, one Soviet, had been held long enough that they no longer recognized their own faces. They asked for something simple, a mirror. Not freedom, not mercy, just a chance to remember what they looked like. The staff member understood exactly what they were asking. He understood why it mattered. And against protocol, he complied. He passed a mirror through the door so they could see themselves. This detail is easy to overlook. It involves no violence, no data, no spectacle. And yet, it is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire story, because it proves awareness. This was not an environment where everyone had lost the ability to recognize suffering. At least some people still understood the emotional reality of the prisoners. They knew these were human beings with fear, memory, and identity. And despite that understanding, the system continued unchanged. The same facilities that allowed for a moment of compassion also continued to operate chambers of torture. The same hands that could offer a mirror could return to work the next day without intervening further. This is the fracture point. It becomes impossible to argue that ideology alone sustained Unit 731. The idea that everyone involved truly believed the prisoners were less than human does not survive this moment. What sustained the system was something colder: compartmentalization. People learned how to separate moments of recognition from moments of action. They learned how to acknowledge suffering without responding to it. They learned how to care briefly and then return to routine. There are other examples like this. Japanese personnel who became infected with diseases were subjected to the same procedures as prisoners. When usefulness ended, protection disappeared. The boundary between us and them proved thinner than ideology suggested. And still, nothing stopped. No uprising, no collective refusal, no meaningful collapse from within. The machine absorbed these moments of humanity and kept moving. This is what makes Unit 731 especially difficult to process. Not that people were incapable of empathy, but that empathy existed and failed to interrupt the system. Evil here was not driven solely by hatred. It was maintained by resignation, by the quiet decision, repeated daily, to not be the one who breaks the chain. And when a system reaches that point, cruelty no longer needs denial. It survives alongside awareness. As the war turned against Japan, Unit 731 did not end in panic. It ended in procedure. When defeat became inevitable, the priority was no longer research. It was erasure. Evidence had to disappear. Witnesses had to be eliminated. Anything that could link the unit to what it had done needed to be destroyed before outside forces arrived. Prisoners were killed systematically. Some were poisoned, others were shot. There was no pretense of experimentation anymore. Their continued existence posed a risk, and that was enough. Facilities were burned. Documents were shredded or buried. Equipment was dismantled. Years of records data built on human suffering were deliberately reduced to ash. The system that had operated with such confidence now turned inward, consuming its final remnants. By the time Allied forces entered the region, Unit 731 no longer existed in any visible form. What remained were rumors, whispers, incomplete reports that sounded too extreme to be believed without proof. And that absence of proof mattered. In the immediate aftermath of the war, global priorities shifted. The world was exhausted. Entire nations were rebuilding. Justice was selective, shaped by politics as much as morality. When investigators began to hear accounts of human experimentation, they encountered resistance, denial, and silence. Those responsible understood that survival depended on cooperation, not with victims, but with power. This is where the story takes its most bitter turn. Rather than face public trials, key figures from Unit 731 entered negotiations. They offered something valuable: data, research results obtained through methods that no ethical institution would ever authorize. For the victors, this information represented leverage in a new global conflict already forming. The Cold War was beginning. Alliances mattered. Knowledge mattered. Accountability did not. Deals were made behind closed doors. Immunity was granted in exchange for cooperation. Names were withheld. Charges were dropped before they could be filed. The system that had protected Unit 731 during the war now protected its architects after it. This was not ignorance. It was calculation. Some members of the unit did face limited consequences, but even these outcomes were minimal compared to the scale of the crimes. Short sentences, quiet releases, lives resumed with new identities and intact careers. Meanwhile, the victims remained anonymous. No trials recorded their suffering. No graves marked their names. Their deaths existed only as missing data points, lives erased first by violence, then by silence. What makes this phase especially difficult to confront is not just the lack of justice, but the ease with which it was avoided. There was no dramatic failure, no collapse of legal systems. Justice simply never became the priority, and once that moment passed, it did not return. For decades, Unit 731 existed in a strange state of denial. Officially, it was dismissed as exaggeration, a conspiracy, a distortion of history. Those who spoke about it publicly were often ridiculed or ignored. The system did not need to threaten silence. Silence was convenient enough on its own. For a long time, Unit 731 existed in a space between rumor and denial. In the years following the war, there was no official reckoning, no public trials that forced the details into the open, no formal acknowledgement that matched the scale of what had occurred. Instead, the subject lingered in fragments whispers among survivors, scattered testimonies, and references buried in declassified archives. Those who attempted to speak openly were often dismissed. Some were labeled unreliable. Others were accused of exaggeration. In certain cases, the story of Unit 731 was treated as propaganda rather than history. Without documents, without confessions, and without institutional backing, the truth was easy to marginalize. This is where historians became essential. Japanese researchers, journalists, and academics began to trace inconsistencies in official narratives. They compared military records. They followed funding trails. They searched for personnel lists that had been quietly archived rather than destroyed. What they found was not a single revelation, but accumulation. One document led to another. One testimony matched another account given years earlier. Slowly, a picture formed that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or fabrication. Resistance followed. Educational authorities pushed back against, including these findings in textbooks. Government representatives acknowledged the existence of Unit 731, but avoided discussing its function. The details, the experiments, the victims, the scope remained officially unspoken. This partial acknowledgement was deliberate. Admitting existence without responsibility allowed the past to be referenced without being confronted. It kept the conversation abstract, controlled, safe. But abstraction fails when evidence accumulates. As more archives were opened internationally, particularly in the United States, immunity agreements and intelligence reports came to light. These documents confirmed not only that Unit 731 existed, but that its leadership had negotiated protection using the data obtained from human experimentation. At that point, denial became impossible. By the 1,990 seconds, the Japanese government formally acknowledged Unit 731 as a real entity. Later, thousands of individuals connected to the unit were named publicly. By then, almost all were dead or unreachable. Accountability, delayed long enough, had become irrelevant. This is the pattern that defines late reckoning. Truth emerges only after consequences can no longer be applied. Names are released only after judgment is no longer possible. Responsibility is acknowledged only when it no longer carries risk. For the victims, this offered no restoration. Their suffering remained unrecorded in most official histories. Their families received no answers. Their names were never returned to them in any meaningful way. And yet, the exposure still matters. Not because it delivers justice, but because it interrupts erasure, because it prevents the lie from becoming permanent, because it forces future generations to confront what was done in their name or with their silence. Unit 731 was nearly lost to history, not because it was small, but because powerful systems benefited from forgetting it. The fact that it is known at all is due to those who refuse to let silence stand as closure. There is no resolution to a story like this. No sentence, no acknowledgement, no delayed admission can balance what was taken. Unit 731 does not end with justice. It ends with absence, with lives erased, records destroyed, and accountability deferred until it no longer mattered. That is the truth of it. What remains is not closure, but understanding. And even that understanding is uncomfortable, because it forces us to abandon simple explanation. It is easier to believe that atrocities happen only when people are ignorant, desperate, or irrational. It is harder to accept that they can happen when people are educated, organized, and fully aware of their actions. Unit 731 was not driven by chaos. It was driven by structure. It was not fueled by misunderstanding. It was sustained by clarity, by people who understood the system they were part of and chose not to disrupt it. This is why remembering matters. Not as a ritual, not as a gesture of moral superiority, but as a refusal to let abstraction take over. When atrocities are reduced to dates, numbers, and distant headlines, they lose their weight. They become something that happened back then, under conditions we believe no longer exist. But the conditions that allowed Unit 731 to operate were not unique. Dehumanization, bureaucratic distance, incentives that reward compliance over conscience, the belief that necessity overrides morality. These are not relics of the 20th century. They are recurring features of power. The people involved were not born into cruelty. They were trained into it, normalized into it, promoted within it, and most importantly, protected by it. That protection is what allowed the system to survive long enough to do what it did, and what allowed many of its architects to live out their lives without consequence. For the victims, history arrived too late. But for everyone else, history remains a warning. Not about how evil some people can be, but about how easily ordinary individuals can become part of something inhuman when responsibility is diluted and obedience is rewarded. There is no comfort to take from this story, only vigilance. Because the danger was never that people didn't know better. The danger was that they did and proceeded anyway. And as long as systems exist that value outcomes over lives, efficiency over ethics, and silence over accountability, stories like this will never belong entirely to the past. They will wait,